St. Martin in the Fields in London in 1635, and it's possible that that's the same William Gifford, although we don't know for sure. London was a metropolitan city where people came from all over England. My guess as to where he would have come from is a place called Dry Drayton in Cambridgeshire, and I'm basing that simply because the name Ananias Gifford, the unusual first name, appears in the Dry Drayton records, and William named one of his sons Ananias. William Gifford, as I said, is in Sandwich, one of the earliest settlers of Sandwich in 1640, and he's named to various offices. He's obviously an upstanding member of the community until an itinerant Quaker preacher named Christopher Holder came around in 1656. And soon, Christopher Holder, by the way, is Peleg Slocum's father-in-law, who lived down here in Dartmouth. And in 1658, William Gifford is fined £5 for refusing to take the oath of fidelity. It's kind of like a pledge of allegiance, which you were required to take yearly back in those days, pledging allegiance not only to the Plymouth colony, but to the Crown of England. And Quakers, as a matter of principle, refused to do this. And William Gifford became associated, although never formally a member, with the Sandwich Quakers, which was the first meeting of Quakers in North America. It was established in 1656. Unlike, say, the Pennsylvania Quakers, for example, who came much later, the people who became Quakers in this area did not come over from England as Quakers. Quakers, in fact, they were already here before Quakerism was invented, if you will, by George Fox back in England in the mid-1640s. William Gifford continued to be fined throughout the decade of the 1660s. He was fined at one time £57 in 1660 for attending Quaker meetings, refusing to take the oath of fidelity, and refusing to take off his hat in court, which is another kind of Quaker protest. They refused to acknowledge the earthly authority of the magistrate. And that's an enormous amount, because at the same time, in the same year, he purchased for less than half that amount, £30, a 1/2 share of land in Dartmouth, which would amount, after it was all parceled out, to well over 1,000 acres. He also owned land in Monmouth, New Jersey, where some of the Quakers went temporarily to escape the persecution in Sandwich, and also owned land in Falmouth. The land in Old Dartmouth he gave to two of his sons, Christopher and Robert. And these are, almost all the Giffords of Old Dartmouth are descended from those two brothers. Both of them, by the way, were fined as well back in Sandwich for their Quaker activities. We can date Robert's appearance in Old Dartmouth, in what is now Westport, to 1683. He was sued that year by the Dartmouth proprietors for living in Dartmouth without permission. Apparently what had happened is that he had established his homestead here, but he had not filed his return of survey with the proprietors, which was the procedure for establishing your homestead. And in the following year, the same complaint was filed by the proprietors against Christopher Gifford. When the two brothers moved down here to Westport, they were not among strangers. Their neighbor to the north, around what's now Fisherville Lane in Westport, was Richard Kirby, Jr., whose wife was their sister, Patience Gifford. Robert Gifford's wife, Sarah Wing, was the sister of Matthew Wing, who was their neighbor further north on Horseneck Road in Westport. Their other neighbors, some of their other neighbors like Increase Allen, Joseph Allen, and Ebenezer Allen, they would have known from their activities, Quaker activities back in Sandwich. Those families, the Allens, Wings, Kirbys, and Giffords, all relocated to Old Dartmouth from Sandwich. The Souls and the Howlands were other families that they would have been familiar with because of their Quaker activities with the Sandwich meeting of Quakers. The first place where Christopher Gifford lived is called the Olde Cellar in the Crane-Worth map of 1713 property divisions, and it's called that Yule Cellar also in deeds. And I think this is it, actually. It's at 1103 Horseneck Road, which this address and property is in the right location. It was kind of an original, a temporary original dwelling of Christopher Gifford, and he probably would have built it about 1685. The historian, lawyer Henry Worth, writing about 100 years ago, said that the Indians thought this a strange type of dwelling, and so they called it Hassaneck, which is their name for a cave or a cavern. And according to Worth, this became anglicized to Horseneck, and later became applied to the wider area. Next. This is another part of the old cellar showing the back wall. It's backed by earth on two sides. It was 42 acres in all. The two Gifford brothers started a kind of family tradition by having two siblings in each family who squabbled with each other continuously. And fortunately, I have no siblings, so I have nobody to pick fights with. But they fought over this land that came down from their father, the 1/2 share of Dartmouth land, over who would own what. And so they owned everything in common until 1718, which is more than 30 years after they got here, where it was finally resolved through arbitration, and they divided up these parcels. Next. It's another. Oh.
You was going down, right?
Yeah.
No, I just hit it twice.
Oh. It's just another shot of the old cellar. Next.
I'm trying to go up now to see if I go backwards. Nothing's happening. No, no. Yeah, that's what I did 3 times.
There you go. Yeah. The house in the background is another Gifford house built in the 1850s. This property, by the way, if you were on the Westport house tour 2 years ago, you would have visited this house. But it was sold out of the Gifford family to the Wings, and then the Ricketsons owned it, but eventually in the mid-1800s came back into the Gifford family. Next. It's another shot of the same back wall of the old cellar. Next. Christopher Gifford moved from the old cellar to another farm that was south of Fisherville Lane. This is part of Robert Gifford's farm. This is part of the old Tuckerman farm off of west of Horseneck Road in Westport. I just took this shot. It's beautiful. This was on the house tour last summer, and it's just beautiful field of wildflowers. Next. There's a vista from what would have been Robert Gifford's farm. This area was called Riverside in the Gifford family. Looking out, there's you see the East Branch of the Westport River there in the distance. Next. Now here come the cows. The cows are coming home. It's a little closer shot of the river. Next. Oh, cow. I had a lot of shot of cows. Next. Not all Giffords were content to remain on the farm. This is a notice. This was posted, actually, this John Gifford II who posted this. This is my fourth great grandfather, and he actually lived up in North Westport. It says, notice, all persons are hereby forbid to trade, trust, or transact business of any kind with Peleg Gifford, son of the subscriber, without the consent of him the said subscriber, and masters of vessels and others are forbidden carrying him to sea without such consent being first obtained. You might think, well, what's going on here? It's like he's blacklisting his own son. And the story behind this is that John Gifford, he required his sons to pay him before they could leave home. It started with his son Isaac, who was the oldest, and Isaac wanted to be a shipbuilder. So he approached his father one day, and he talked about he wanted to move to New Bedford to learn how to be a shipbuilder. And John said, oh, that's fine. You can do that as soon as you pay me $400, which was a lot of money back then. And Isaac says, I don't remember borrowing $400. And John says, no, you didn't borrow anything. But that's my estimate of how much it's cost me to provide food and clothing and such over the years. So before you leave, you'll have to pay me that. And from a different source entirely, I came across the story of Levi Gifford, another son who became a shipbuilder. Levi had to pay $300 before he could leave home. Peleg, I think, was the next son in line, and Peleg thought he'd take a shortcut and skip out without paying, which shows you what his father did. When that happened, he put a notice, and he suspected, you could tell from that, masters of vessels and others, he suspected that he would put to sea, and Peleg ultimately did. He became a ship captain himself. And the good news is, I guess, John and Peleg were reconciled. I'll mention him again, of John and Peleg, when I talk about the construction of Gifford Road in Westport. Next. This is from Henry Worth's account. It's called Indian Names of Old Dartmouth. It's in Old Dartmouth Historical Sketches. It was discovered that the word Hoseneck, according to the native pronunciation, was almost identical with horseneck. This word meant cave, cavern, or enclosure with stone covering or sides. Literally, it means a stone house a short distance north of the shore on the west side of the road, meaning Christopher Gifford's place. Farm which before 1700 contained a tract described as the old cellar. And so that's his account. I'm not sure, is that where the name horseneck comes from? I'm not really sure. I've seen very, very old references to horseneck, and it's originally two words, horse neck, not one word. But that is a possibility anyway. It's something to keep in mind. Next. This is the northern part of the Robert Gifford farm, which is a very big farm, about 360 acres. This is on Petty Lane, which runs west off Horseneck Road in Westport. And this north part of the farm in family tradition was called Rockland. And it's probably for land like this that they call it Rockland. The photo doesn't really do it justice, but this area is just covered with these huge boulders and huge rocks, and the property in all is 35 acres. It's owned by the Westport Land Conservation Trust now. And explains another theme of the early Giffords was their disputes with the Dartmouth proprietors. they had a running argument with them about they weren't getting sufficient land given the quality of land that they were getting. And this was probably Exhibit A in their complaints. I imagine when the proprietors came around, they wouldn't bring them down to that nice part of the farm down where the Tuckerman farm later was. They'd show them this, all covered with rocks and kind of useless. And they may have even planted rocks here to make it look even worse. I don't know. Next. It's another part of the same Petty Lane, Rockland area, which is on the north side of Petty Lane. Next. This is, the Robert Gifford farm went all the way from the river, all the way, the southeast point would be at this. This is on Crossroad, on the Dartmouth-Westport line, right near Division Road, looking west. Robert Gifford would own to the right, and William Cornell owned to the left. On the area to the right, after Robert died, went to his son, Benjamin Gifford, whose daughter, Mariba Gifford, was, I think, the fourth great-grandmother of Winston Churchill. Churchill's mother was American, had a lot of American ancestry, including the Giffords. Next. This is down at Westport Point. Where am I here? 2002 Main Road. Among other properties that Christopher Gifford owned was a separate purchase he made from Daniel Wilcox, which was Westport Point, which was called Pekachek Point in the deed, which he bought in 1699. Christopher I did not live at Westport Point. He lived on Horseneck Road, and then he died in Little Compton, probably living over in Adamsville with his son, Enos. The first Gifford to live at Westport Point, and first white person to live at Westport Point, was Christopher II, who built a house back towards the river from this house about 1720. The plaque on this house gives the dates 1720 and 1810. The main part of the house, this federal part, is built about 1810, but in the interior there are portions of it that appear to be from a much older house. Christopher wanted to, he ran a ferry over to Horseneck, and Christopher III, and he wanted to keep it, his private, like a gated community. He had a barway across the road leading down to Westport Point. But he was either a very sickly man or a hypochondriac, because over the years he had to start selling off pieces of Westport Point to pay his doctor bills. So he died a fairly old man in 1824, but his estate was insolvent, and a lot of his descendants, in order to get a piece of the original Christopher Gifford farm at Westport Point, had to redeem it by paying money into the estate. Next.
Quick question, Dick.
Yes.
The white chimneys with black top, are they, that's indicative of support of the, of Britain?
It's a good question. I don't know. Any chimney specialist out there?
Well, I thought, yeah. Learned that in old history class.
Oh yeah, could well be. Could well be. I don't know. Yeah. The old house would have been out towards the river from there behind that car. That's out towards the river where the Route 88 bridge starts to go over. Yes.
Do you know what his wife's name was?
Christopher III, Deborah Borden, I believe.
Deborah Borden?
Yeah.
Or Deborah Howland?
Christopher III was married to a Borden, and Christopher IV, I believe, was married to a Howland. But I don't have that with me. And they, in fact, thinking of Bordens, they were also, Christopher III was an ancestor of Lizzie Borden, who had Gifford
Don't say that.
ancestry as well. Next. This is the house of Christopher IV, which is right up the road, 1990 Main Road. Greek Revival, built 1834. He, like a lot of the Giffords in that area, was a ship captain. Next. That's another shot of the house of Christopher IV. I've always found that the ship captains, they had this predilection for these wrought iron fencing across the front. Some houses, I think they took down the stone wall and put up this wrought iron fencing with a granite post. Next. This is up at the head of Westport. 43 Drift Road, the house of Adam Gifford, who was a sheriff. This house had, like a lot of houses, especially up at the head, this house actually moved a lot. Originally it was over by Pacific Union Church. Supposedly when Adam built it, he incorporated an old schoolhouse that had been on Forge Road into the house. I don't know if that's the L that extends on the south side or not. It's kind of an unusual, asymmetric, 6-bay house with off-centered chimney. But it was moved after he had died. It was moved in the 1870s to this location. The house on the right, by the way, 41 Drift Road, it's not a Gifford house, but this house supposedly was moved from where the stone house was across the road. And if, I don't know how Macris, the official listing of the house, it has an 1802 construction date. If that's true, then that would have been the house of John Avery Parker back when he lived in humble Westport before he moved on to fame and fortune in New Bedford. Next. This is Adam's brother, Abner B. Gifford. This is up 496 Old County Road. Abner and Adam built this house together in 1830 before Adam built his own house. The L that extends to the left, to the west, was originally a general store that was later attached to this house. There's another rear L that you can't see here, which was another old house that was moved here from Drift Road down by Lyons Brook. This was a stop on the stagecoach route to New Bedford, where the horses were changed. It served as Westport's courthouse in the 1850s. And Abner B. Gifford it served as the office of the last office of the Dartmouth proprietors. When Abner died in 1847, all of the unresolved mysteries of the Dartmouth propriety died with him. And the people who were remaining said, well, we can't make sense out of anything about who has what claim from this point. So they wrapped up their business. Next. This is the house that you could see in the previous picture right next to it. This is the John Gifford house, 498 Old County, built 1775, probably the oldest house at the head of Westport. He was a sea captain who, during the Revolution, was engaged in smuggling past the British blockade. A lot of Westport captains were fairly prominent in bringing in gunpowder and things like that from the French West Indies to the revolutionary forces up here. This was an inn in the early days where people, I imagine, who were on the stagecoach or whatever could stop over. And in the mid-1800s, it was owned by George H. Gifford, who served as the local judge. George H. Gifford was kind of a jack of all trades. He was, had the mill, they had a shingle mill, which is located on the river to the northwest, to the left, and far to the rear of this house, at which they manufactured spokes for wagon wheels and also caskets, which came in handy for George H. Gifford. Next. Because in this building, which is his barn to the rear, that's really Westport's first funeral parlor, which he also opened, conveniently located just down the road from the, at that time, fairly new Linden Grove and Maple Grove cemeteries. George H. Gifford was instrumental in founding the Westport Temperance Society. He had been a heavy drinker himself early in life, but became a teetotaler later. He was a gourmet cook, and the lawyers who would come to have cases heard by him, he would treat to a very nice meal, unless they were representing liquor interest, in which case all they got was hard crackers. Next. This is a house, probably it's on 205 Gifford Road, probably built by either John Gifford, the guy, different John Gifford, the one I mentioned, who placed the advertisement against his son Peleg in the newspaper, or by one of his sons. Next. It's another view of the same house. Next. Either that one is John Gifford's house or this one. This one's right across from Macomber School. John Gifford had 5 of his sons who lived on Gifford Road, which apparently when he started was just kind of a driftway, right-of-way. He got his tax bill one day, and it was for $6, and for whatever reason, he said he wasn't going to pay it. Not one penny of the tax bill was he going to pay. And he owned, I think, about 400 acres, so it doesn't sound like a really high bill. But in any event, they still had a statute on the books in those days from out of respect to the Quakers, because a lot of local tax money was used to fund the militia. So in lieu of making a payment of taxes, you could kind of work off your bill. And the statutory rate was $1.50 per day for a man with a team of oxen. And so John Gifford decided to work off his bill by constructing Gifford Road. And his neighbors noticed this went on, week after week, month after month. He's still working on the road. And they said, well, John, you've certainly paid your tax bill by now. What are you doing? And he said, well, I set out, I'm going to build a road to go visit my sons, and I'll be done when I'm done. And supposedly that's why at the southern end of Gifford Road, it's a nice straight north and south road until you get to the ferry farm down by the head. Then all of a sudden it goes east and west. And supposedly that was because his son Isaac lived off on the west side of the road, and his son Peleg lived over by the river, same guy who was in the ad, lived over by the river on the east side. And that's where he ended the road. So his neighbor's next question was, well, John, you built the road all that way. Why didn't you finish it down to the head of Westport? And he said, well, I built it to go visit my sons. I'm not interested in going to the head of Westport. If somebody wants to go to the head, they're going to have to finish it themselves. Next. This is over in Adamsville, just over the Rhode Island line. Adamsville was for a while, it was sometimes called by some people Giffordsville. Some people call it Giffordsville, some people call it Tabor's Mills. And they resolved that Okay, thank you. They resolved that by calling it neither and naming it after John Quincy Adams, who had been president, and it's been known by that ever since. Probably half of the old houses in Adamsville were built by Giffords. This one here was finished by Giffords, but not started by them. It was started by Samuel Church, who came over from Fairhaven and owned a share in what's now Gray's Gristmill. And with his brother Ebenezer, who later built what became Abraham Manchester Store, operated what we now know as Gray's Store. Their sister Deborah married Warren Delano back in Fairhaven, and they were the grandparents of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Samuel Church had a salt works behind this house towards the river. The river is off to the left. And in the Great Gale of 1815, he was making repairs, or after the Great Gale, he was making the repairs, and a beam fell on him and killed him, and the house was only partly constructed. And so Noah Gifford bought the property in the unfinished house and finished it. But this is it's a fine example of a federal-style house, but an unusual design in a sense, because you see the front facade, it's on the gable end, which makes it unusual. There's an explanation for that. Next. The original facade is really off on the left-hand side here. This laneway was the road until the 1830s. And if you ever notice, Gray's Store is the same thing. What appears to be the front of the building that faces the road is actually the side, the gable end, and the front of that building actually faces this house across that old road. Next. This is a feature, the Spite Tower, which is on the property. Giffords didn't have anything to do with that, but one of the more popular buildings in Adamsville, around which a lot of mythology is told, usually that somehow was interrupting communications. Abraham Manchester, who lived above the store, so that he couldn't communicate by lantern or with either his girlfriend or his sisters or by somebody. But in essence, it's really just in the days before electricity, if you wanted tap water, which Dr. John Hathaway, who bought that old house, wanted, they built this kind of well house. They've got the pumps on the first floor and a water tank up on the third floor. Next. This is 1818 Main Road back towards Westport Point. It's an unusual kind of cross-gabled house with some Italian features, built about 1855 by Captain Benjamin Gifford, a great-grandson of Christopher III. Benjamin Gifford went to sea at the age of 7 with his uncle, Captain Gideon Davis, on the ship Hope. In later years, Gifford commanded several ships himself, including the Mattapoisett and the President, which sailed out of Westport Point. He became wealthy and served 2 terms as a state representative. Next. This is Westport Point, the Perry Gifford House, 2028. Another ship captain and a son of Christopher III, whose house is just up the road to the left. Beyond that is Tony Connor's house, which was owned at one time by Abner Gifford, who was ancestor of Marilyn Monroe. And we'll see another one of Abner Gifford's houses in a couple of minutes. On the reminds me of stories about going to sea and such back in those days. one of John Gifford, the guy who built Gifford Road, one of his grandsons was a guy by the name of Henry Handy Gifford, who went to sea on a whaling ship out of Westport Point, and they were in a boat chasing the whale. The whale turned on him, stove in the boat, injured him. He was left in the water for about 24 hours before he was found, brought back on ship. And when they coming back into port, the owners of the ship offered him a position as an officer on the next voyage out. And he wanted to accept, but he declined because he was still in poor health. But in a way, that whale that stove in his boat saved his life, because that ship was the Theophilus Chase, was sailed out of Westport Point in 1849 and disappeared at sea with all hands. It's the worst maritime disaster in Westport history. Next. This is a map done by Eleanor Tripp. This is properties at the head of Westport. There's the river coming down here. It's Old County Road going over this way. Christopher and Robert Gifford owning all the way from the river on the north side of Old County up to Reed Road. Robert Gifford owning east side of Landing. Christopher and Robert Gifford owning another property on this Gifford Road running down here, and Drift Road. So they own property pretty much all over Westport. This shows some of the properties that the two brothers owned up at the head. Next. This is from the Crane Worth maps. So the property ownership as of 1713. This is Robert Gifford Homestead here, 360 acres. This Division Road over here, Horseneck Road over here, it's the river over there. Next. This is a little further south on Horseneck Road, same map. Richard and Robert Kirby, so Fisherville Lane runs about here. This is the kind of second homestead of Christopher Gifford, which is to the south of that. And this here, Eel Cellar, which is 42 acres down here. Again, on the west side of Horseneck Road. Next. Whose beautiful house is this? This is Dan Socha's house. The well-kept house. This house was built by William Gifford, son of Jeremiah, probably about 1750. The Macris listings, if you look in the official listings to this house, I mean, they go on and on. They get about 15, 20 pages or something like that. But all they have for who built it is, they think, either Joseph Russell or part of a Smith farm. But this actually, the property would have been part of the old Joseph Landers property, who then sold it to Matthew Wing, who then sold it to his nephew Jeremiah Gifford. If you trace through the deeds a bit, you can see that this property was given to his son, William. Next. This is it's another kind of settlement of Giffords, which until recently I wasn't really aware of. This is over, really, I guess you'd say just north of Padenham along Elm Street. There's a whole bunch of old Gifford houses along here. This is 557 Elm Street. This is Charles S. Gifford. It's a Greek Revival, built about 1830. He was a shipbuilder, and it shows there's probably quite a bit of shipbuilding going on in Apponeganset, Padenham at the time. Next. This is right up the street, 590 Elm Street. Daniel Gifford house, somewhat older house, three-quarter cape, built about 1800. Next, this farmhouse, Charles H. Gifford house. This is 658 Elm Street. It's a circa 1750 Georgian. Really, the stonework of this is very good, and it's still got the outbuildings. It really still looks like an intact farm. Probably, I think, built by Timothy Gifford Jr., although I'm not really sure. I just became aware of this collection of houses a couple of weeks ago, and I'll sometime take a closer look at that. Next. This is another Gifford house, right practically next door to that one, 666 Elm Street. This one has a plaque, and it does say Abner Gifford. So Marilyn Monroe's ancestor lived here. This is a half cape. Next, this is another half cape just down the road, 651 Elm Street. William H. Gifford lived here in the mid-1800s. Okay, I think is that, oh no, we're back to the beginning. So that's the end. So that's the short story of the Giffords in Dartmouth. Any questions?
If you go to the Howland family line, that's where the Marilyn Monroe comes in. Howland. You go that line, that's where you get Marilyn Monroe coming in.
Let me see, I'm trying. No, her biological father was a Gifford.
Really?
From New Bedford, yes.
But it does, you go on.
But it would include.
You go on and you follow it, you will come to where it
Eventually, well,
says Marilyn Monroe. It is part of that line, too.
yeah, her father was, I'm trying to remember her father's name, but I can't be. He was born in Newport. Charles Stanley Gifford, I think his name was, who looked a lot like Clark Gable. He worked in the studios, not as an actor or anything, but just he worked with Marilyn Monroe's mother, who also worked in the studio, kind of behind the scenes, creating sets and things like that. Her official father was the husband of Marilyn's mother, but he was not the biological father because they had split up several years prior to that. Marilyn Monroe herself always regarded Charles Stanley Gifford as her father and told other people about it. Yeah. Sure. Yes?
Back to the origin of horseneck.
Yes.
You know, you mentioned the Allens and the Wings. Well, there was a Wings family and a Wings neck, and an Allen and an Allen's neck. So you think maybe there was a horse and horse neck.
It could be. It could be. Like I said, the Giffords would have been familiar with both families. The Wings, Matthew Wing married Widow Ricketson, so they lived just to the north on Horseneck Road.
She was a Mott. She was born.
Yeah, she was a Mott. William Ricketson died. Matthew Wing then married the widow, Ricketson. The Allens lived all over the place. Not just Allen's Neck, but all over the place, including names on those crane maps that I showed you. A lot of the Gifford neighbors were Allens there. You had Increase Allen over on the Dartmouth side of Division Road. Ebenezer Allen was just north of that part of the farm I called Rockland.
What was the relationship between Old Dartmouth and Westport?
Well, Westport, Old Dartmouth is a colloquial name used to describe the towns of the original Dartmouth, which is Westport, Dartmouth, New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Acushnet.
Town called Old Dartmouth.
Yeah.
Dartmouth.
Yeah, meaning Old Dartmouth is like Dartmouth before the split up.
Yeah.
Westport split off in 1787. The other towns did it different
Bedford was
years.
the same year.
Yeah.
Bedford broke off the same year.
Yeah. Yeah, we have on the website for the Dartmouth Historical and Art Society, if you look in there, I think there's a diagram showing
Right, we have
the years
the history.
that the towns split off. Yes, sir.
So we're with John Hanson, Gifford's grandsons. So he, as I understand the story, right, he came out of Adamsville in a house that was split between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The boundary ran through the middle of the house.
Was that the house that Delano's owned at one point? There was a
Uncertain.
Delano family?
Uncertain. But apparently his...
That house, I showed a house in Adamsville, the only house I focused on in Adamsville. I think the house you're talking about would be down that laneway to the left. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Because I know when the Delanos owned it, that supposedly Delano, who was a real estate broker, remember George Delano from the Delanos? His father, who was a real estate broker in Massachusetts, wanted to keep his Massachusetts license, so he moved the bedroom or something to put it over on the Massachusetts side of the line. But yeah,
Okay.
supposedly the state line ran right through the
All right.
house.
Now, my grandfather's mother, as we understand the story, right, became the first Quaker minister. Because they didn't have really ministers, but she took that role. Are you familiar with that story at all? Became maybe a likeness? No?
No. What was her name?
I don't know.
No.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Mrs. Gifford.
Yeah, I don't know. But the Quakers, even the early Quakers, they sometimes referred to people as ministers, even though officially they didn't have. I think the real early Quakers would have been offended at the term minister,
Right.
because that associates with the Congregational Church, who they were very much estranged from. Anybody else?
I would like to apologize for being a little bit late. I don't know if you've ever watched television with your eyes closed. That's what I was doing. I'm normally here on time. I know nobody needs to introduce Richard. He's been here many times before, but I'm sure he was introduced.
Yes, he will.
And he's one of our favorite speakers. We have an ongoing project that we also wanted to tell you about. I'd also like to greet the young fellows named Hawes that are there. I used to work for their grandfather, believe it or not. You want me to feel old? I worked for their grandfather. But you're all welcome here, and this is our Sunday afternoon series. But our project is a very ambitious project, and it has to do with the Dartmouth Society of Friends. We have 6,000 pages of their records, from their minutes and their removals and the disciplines and all the records of the Dartmouth monthly meeting, which are undergoing a project to transcribe, meaning put them into a form that you can read with a computer and index and so forth, which is a pretty large project. So we just wanted to put you on notice that we're going to be looking for volunteers and support for doing that project as we move down the road. A little further, Richard is part of the team with Dan and Bernie Gifford and several other members of our board of directors, I'm sure will be helping us. And it's an exciting project, one that I think everyone realizes that people move from Dartmouth to other places. And if they were Quakers, and many early Dartmouth people were, they were given essentially a passport to the new meeting wherever they were going, which said they were in good standing, they were good citizens, etc., and so on. And that gives us good genealogical information to trace the family. Who was in the family that moved, usually in the record, when they moved, where they moved. And if they didn't move, they didn't name the town, they would name the meeting that was nearest the town where they were moving. So all of these are part of what we're transcribing, which will become very rich information for all the genealogists in the world who are descended from Dartmouth Quakers, and that's many, many people. You can just imagine, literally millions of people, because it was a common thing to get away from those rocky fields and find some good stuff. Somebody thinks I'm still sleeping. Excuse me, I'll shut it off. But anyway, welcome to our Sunday